Greco-Roman golden plates, whose names and written testimonies we still have today. 3 of those witnesses say that they saw the angel Moroni give Joseph Smith the plates with their own eyes. And even when they fell out with Joseph Smith and left the church, they still continued to assert that they had witnessed these events.
And I think the very simple answer is that Joseph Smith and these early witnesses were charlatans. I'm sure that Alex would agree with that assessment, that these men were not sincerely mistaken that they had seen the golden plates. Rather, they were just lying about what they saw. I think that is the correct and plausible explanation of this circumstance. But notice, that explanation, when you try to carry it over to the first disciples of Jesus, it becomes completely untenable. No scholar today would support the old deistic theory that the earliest disciples stole the body of Jesus and then lied about the resurrection appearances.
I just question, what founding cult member would you trust ever in any period in history? There's this kind of no true Scotsman kind of mentality that you get with William Lane Craig. No good scholar, or no scholar alive today, this kind of thing, keep saying this kind of thing. No, there's plenty of scholars alive today that talk about the missing body as a possible hoax or something that the disciples stole the body. This is still a going kind of hypothesis that is out there. I think it's maybe even the strongest one. I've got that same perspective myself. And the critics that are standing there that are willing to voice that, hey, call this what it is, they're seeing charlatanism in it. If you go look at Lucian, he describes this as a charlatan movement with gullible people and leaders that are defrauding people. And so that's his external, vivid kind of impressions that he's getting. And he's in Syria, so he's right there in the stomping grounds of all this. He's seen it all grow up right around him.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I have Dr. Richard C. Miller joining us again. How are you doing, Dr. Miller?
I'm doing great, Derek. It's another day in paradise. We survived the fires out here in California, so happy to, well, not all of us, but the Miller family made it through there and local community.
I'm sorry that's happening over there. I hope things do get better and the fires are quenched. We're going to be dealing with a different kind of fire today. A fire that is lit by apologetics, a fire that I think I once held sacred and, of course, combat now, because I think it's not honest in the way that it's dealing with history and data fairly. It's not doing that. And so there's a lot of special pleading and other things. But in this video, I'm going to play 15 clips from a single interview with Sean McDowell and Dr. William Lane Craig. I think Sean has a PhD. I'm not 100% sure on whose PhDs or not. I get in trouble by other people too that are critical scholars who say that's actually a mill that they issue these PhDs that are not really, like, I don't know. I don't do all the research on all that, so I don't really know. I just respect the PhD. If they say they're a doctor, I go with doctor, whatever. But I'm going to play these 15 clips. I'm going to try not to interrupt. I might jump in to have clarification or have you touch on something that I think maybe you forgot to address, or it's important that I know you might have something good to say about. And other than that, I'm going to be practically a fly on the wall listening to your response after each of them. Are you prepared?
Oh, well, let's ready or not. Here we go.
All right, here we go.
Wes says that Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God himself. I don't think that's true. Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's just in John's Gospel that divine claims begin to appear. I and the Father are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Before Abraham was, ego eimi. I actually still don't think even these count, and we'll explain why in another video, but let's just say that they do. Even if this was Jesus explicitly claiming to be God, don't you think it's a bit suspicious that these claims only show up in our latest gospel? If Jesus was known to be walking around claiming explicitly to be God himself, did the other 3 gospel authors just not think this was relevant? A minor, unimportant detail not worth including?
Essentially, here's the key question I'd love for you to weigh in on, Bill. To confidently believe that Jesus is God, Do we need explicit first-person claims? And did Jesus adequately claim to be God in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which came before John?
In my published work, I've tried to show that historically, Jesus of Nazareth made highly significant Christological claims about himself, whereby he put himself in the place of God himself. For example, he claimed to be the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. He claimed to be the Son of God in a unique sense. He claimed to be the divine human Son of Man prophesied by the prophet Daniel. And all of these offices or titles come together at the trial scene in Mark's gospel. The high priest, the leader of the Sanhedrin, charges Jesus under oath, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus responds, "I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." A virtual quotation from Daniel 7. So here you see claims that assert the divinity of Jesus by use of these significant Christological titles. And immediately the high priest and the Sanhedrin recognized the blasphemy of what he had said and condemned him to death.
Yeah. There's a lot going on there. I haven't listened to William Lane Craig, probably not my go-to place for my research at this point, but there's a big difference, I think, between the approach that, say, and it coming from his place, he's defending what he sees as the Christian religion in his own terms, that is, in terms of evangelical kind of belief and creed and this kind of thing. So he maps the New Testament onto that framework, that kind of Sunday school evangelical theological frame. And so that's not something I would do. My idea is to help map the New Testament onto classical antiquity. And so to see these texts as they originally would have registered in the ancient mind, and irregardless of whether this is, something that's considered kosher in modern evangelical Sunday schools or creeds or this kind of thing. And so he's coming from a defense kind of mechanism there to try and prop up a kind of a Trinitarian idea around Jesus. And I think that's what he sees as under attack here, Alex. And so the idea is to try and see as much of that later theological development as possible within these early incepted works. I do not foist, from my standpoint, my own kind of methodological standpoint, I don't foist on the text these later theological creeds and systems of thought and kind of designs and structures and this kind of thing. And so when I read something like Mark, I read at the beginning, it says that it's an arché, that is a kind of an etiological story, a story of origins regarding the good news of Jesus Christ, a son of a God. And now that would have registered pretty clearly in the ancient world as a demigod. It would not be equal to God proper, like the Platonic monad or something like this. This would be a hero figure that's an elevated divine. Yes, I would agree with him that it does signal divinity, but it's not the same thing as equating Jesus with, the God who created all things and this kind of thing at that point, at least in that text. When you get over to John, you do see a creation kind of idea there with the Logos, right? That Jesus is the Logos. But even there, you go back to Plato and that whole kind of system of thought. What is that? That's the demiurgos. It's not the same thing as the God proper, the monad at the top. Rather, it's an emanation. The idea there is that God is transcendent. Plato's God was so transcendent that he needed to make an emanation that would create all things. And so a lot of what's going on in Platonic philosophy is trying to answer, and even in Gnosticism for that matter, is trying to answer this question: whence did all things come from? You've got the Logos as an emanation, as a conduit for the creation of all things, because God can't get his hands dirty in that business, and so it creates an emanation of himself. And so when you see inside of the Gospel of John, now that isn't really drawn out as a theme a whole lot. The prologue of John sits there, and then the rest of John exists. But you get this idea that, if you've seen me, you've seen the God. In other words, you've seen God. The idea is that I'm the emanation of God in that way. And it's kind of the chief representative of that. But that is a theological development. It is unique to John. You don't get that in the other Gospels. And it's not the same thing as saying that they're precisely the same. I and the Father are one. And you'd go on and say that in John 15, the expectation is that we're all going to be one. You and me, I and you, et cetera, et cetera. And so this oneness idea there, to try and turn that into a theological mechanism to prop up Trinitarianism at that point, this early in the the development of Christian mythology, would be a misstep. It'd be retrojection of theological cargo back into these earliest texts.
Now, in addition to the explicit claims, there are also implicit Christological claims that Jesus made, whereby he put himself in God's place. For example, his claim to be able to forgive sins. In Mark chapter 2, we have the story of the healing of the paralytic. And Jesus says to the man, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And Mark records that those standing about murmured and said, who does this man think he is? No one can forgive sins, but God alone. And Jesus, knowing what they're saying, says, which do you think is easier? To say your sins are forgiven, or rise, get up, and take your bed and go home? And he says that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He says to the paralytic, I say to you, rise, get up, and go home. And the man is miraculously healed. Clearly in Mark's gospel, this is a claim to divinity exercising authority to forgive sins.
The authority that we see in the Gospels that Jesus has is a given authority. It's authority. You see it at the very tail end, kind of the commission at the end of Matthew, that all authority has been given to me. That he didn't have that authority of himself. It's authority that's vested in him from God above. And so, and later on, even in Luke, there's this idea that he gives it even to the apostles, their ability to Peter and so forth, the ability to go ahead and forgive sins as well. Whatever you forgive will be forgiven, the binding and loosing, and all these kinds of ideas are there, kind of passed on. And even it goes further and says, those that follow him, even greater things shall you do than I've done, this kind of thing. And so there's this kind of passing on of authority, but I think from my standpoint, he's trying to read back in, kind of goes back to this retrojection, trying to read back into that, the divinity of Jesus as being equal to the Father, which is a later, like I would say, a later theological construct that just isn't in these inceptive documents, at least not in the way that he should be comfortable with at this point. But, that's his job, is to defend the castle at all costs. My job is to try and understand with precision and detail what was going on in these varied variegated mythological constructs that we find in the New Testament. And some of the problem there, and we'll get into this later, is that the mythologization, you've got history being mythicized, and you've got mythology being historicized, or myth being historicized, and that comes together in the legendization of Jesus in these early sacred texts. They become kind of a canvas for this legendization project in terms of sacralizing their family figure. And so, you're going to find these things in there, but the way he's arguing is that this is an objective reality that we're all faced with somehow. Whereas what I see in these texts is this crafting of these early cultic narratives in various ways, and a canvas of myth making and legend making and sacralized material aimed at identity formation and the construct of these early communities and their philosophy and beliefs. So
I would just add this really quickly before we move to the second one, that I think Mark has a very high Christology. So some of the implicit claims, like even in Mark 1, healing the leper, It's interesting in 2 Kings chapter 5, the king of Israel receives a request to heal Naaman of leprosy, and he says, "Am I God?" There was the sense that only God could heal leprosy. And of course, Jesus does it by his own power immediately without the ritual of Elijah. Go to Mark 2, like you explained, the healing of the paralytic clearly shows. I mean, Michael Bird wrote, he said, Jesus claims for himself an unmediated divine authority that to those steeped in Jewish monotheism looks like absolute blasphemous. You move to Mark chapter 4. Jesus rebukes the winds and the waves, and they immediately become calm. Well, the theme in Psalms is that Yahweh alone controls the sea and other waters. Hence, at the crossing of the Red Sea, we see that portrayed. The Gospels report the disciples saying, "Who then is this that even the wind and sea obey him?" This is reminiscent of the Psalms, "Who is mighty as you are, O Lord." Two more quick examples just to make this, and these are only a few of them, as you know. The demoniac bows down to Jesus. Now, what's interesting in context is he was not showing respect, but fear on behalf of the large number of demons possessing him in the thousands. This army of 2,000 or more demons was deathly afraid of Jesus, and he falls prostrate in an act of worship of a supernatural power, even greater than a legion of demons. And then finally, like you said, these implicit claims come to be explicit in Mark 14, where Jesus claims to be the divine figure, the Son of Man. And I think just to buttress this case, he comes on the clouds, divine status, served by all nations, and will have an everlasting universal kingdom. So I think the earliest Christology is a high Christology.
Wow, there's so much to say there. It's my brain is flooded. It's just too much coming out of this bigot there from my standpoint. So there's a lot of assumptions that are baked into that the entire ancient world, again, it comes from mapping what you see in the Gospels to a church-going, pew-sitting, Bible in lap kind of contained, explanation for what's there, which is not what a historian would be doing, not what a literary critic would be doing. This is, not a correct handling of the text from that standpoint. And so if you get back into antiquity, Jesus had to compete with all of these other wonder workers and people that did have authority, Heracles and Asclepius, and even the Magi, the mages of antiquity who had authority over demons and wielded demons quite a bit. And we even see this present in some of the pseudepigraphical literature that comes forward. There's even legends about the temple being built under Solomon by his divine authority over a whole army of demons. He enlists them to build the temple. Now, it does signal that he has authority and divine authority, and that's fine, but to try and create this kind of sui generis, this kind of unique, one-of-a-kind picture out of Jesus that doesn't look, it is to neglect seeing him as part of the larger fabric of antiquity of that time period and the way that things were constructed. The idea of having authority over the winds and this kind of, you can go back to Odysseus and Aeolus gave him the whole bag, all the winds. Like he was able to govern what directions the winds went with his boat, this kind of thing when he landed on the island of Aeolia. And so he went away with this bag of winds and was able to manipulate that. We've already talked, I think, in prior discussions about how, Galilee is not a sea. We need to get over this. This is a lake. It's where you go fishing. It's, with grandpa and this kind of thing. This isn't the high seas, and this is not a big high seas adventure, but it's in the Gospels, it is crafted as such in order to create a competitive and immediately charged, vivid image that would have registered as potent within the ancient Hellenized mind of that time. And so, and Jesus having authority over those things, of course, makes sense in that way, being that he's the demigod he's kind of the culmination of the demigod tradition in the Gospels in that way. That's really the question. At the beginning, he's a son of a god. This is in Mark, right? Well, the next time you see that phrase clearly given as with a Roman centurion, the cross, watching the way he dies and this kind of thing, there's different interpretations that are played on it. But one of the things what he says there is, surely this man was a son of a god. And there's, again, it's anarthrous in the sense that we're not dealing with a specific theological structure like what these guys would probably want to see retrojected back onto the text. Rather, you've got a Roman, and this is the way what he's seeing through his Roman eyes. He's seeing somebody that is a hero, at least in this text. It's supposed to be registering as, hey, if you're a Roman reading this text, here's how you should interpret our hero. He's a demigod, just like you're used to in so many ways. And so begin with that as kind of the foundation idea of how you interpret this guy. And that comes up again in the trial. Are you the Son of the Most High? But again, that's going back to Son of Man, which again is a charged image. These fellows, it seems like, are constraining their research to, well, this is a reference to Daniel. Well, by the time you get to the writing of the New Testament Gospels, there was so much more that had been elaborated on what the Son of Man was. And you can get back into the Enoch tradition, where he's basically presiding over the eschaton and the apocalypse and this kind of thing at the end of the age. It's sort of and again, to conflate those two with as God proper, no, this is mythology that's not at that rank yet, but is rather somebody that's enlisted by God proper to supervise the end of the age. So they're creating this extra kind of elevated Christology there. Even just using the term Christology, that had not really been fully litigated by that time. There were ideas about someone coming back as a kind of a rescuing figure that would redeem the Jewish people from the oppressors and the various empires that had occupied that area. But to try and just feed into that all that Christianity became, 3 or 4 centuries later, it would be a dishonest move. And so I would not, advise that kind of perspective on what's being conveyed and communicated in the Gospels.
Anyway, Wes also mentioned how it was amazing that the early church grew from 11 scared disciples to overhauling the Roman world. On this, the sociologist Rodney Stark estimates that in its first 300 years, Christianity grew at a rate of 40% per decade, from a small group in the 1st century to 3 million in the 4th century. That sounds pretty impressive, until you learn that this is the same growth rate experienced by Mormonism since its foundation in the 19th century. So if the rate of Christianity's growth is good evidence of its truth, Mormonism just became a whole lot more plausible.
Here's the root of the question I'm curious for you to weigh in on. Is the amazing growth of Christianity a good argument for Christianity? If so, what about the growth of Mormonism?
Here my sympathies are with Alex. I do not think that you can simply point to the growth in the size of a movement as a good argument for the truth of the founding principles of that movement. Islam would be another counterexample. Islam grew tremendously after Muhammad and took over much of the world, even threatened the Christian West. And so it's simply not true that the success of a movement is indicative of the truth of that, of what the movement stands for. Rather, in my published work, I've tried to recast this consideration in terms of explaining the very origin of the Christian movement itself. What I mean is this: we know that Christianity sprang into being sometime about mid-1st century. Where did it come from? What caused this movement to arise? Well, all scholars agree that the movement arose because these earliest disciples had suddenly and sincerely come to believe that Jesus had been raised by God from the dead. And that raises then the further question, well, where in the world did they come up with that belief? And I think that the best explanation for the origin of that belief and the transformation in these first disciples is that they were right, that God had raised Jesus from the dead.
I think in fairness, Wes would agree with you. I don't think he was necessarily saying that this amazing growth proves Christianity is true. I think he's saying this requires an explanation from 11 scared disciples to overhauling the Roman world. So I really think it would line up with your point. Now, obviously, numbers alone are not, they don't prove that something is true or not. I mean, if stats are right, by 2070, Islam could be larger than Christianity. Does that prove it's true? Of course not. But I think we don't have to do this here, but we can look at some of the differences between even the growth of Christianity, completely unexpected in Christianity, versus the opportunities to grow in the 19th century with kind of a Christian framework in the burned over district which Mormonism came from. We could splice some of those differences, but I don't think it's really relevant. The big question is what explains this growth? Yeah. And they consistently pointed to the claim that Jesus had died, risen from the grave, and appeared to them. I think that's the heart of it. Really, really well said.
Oh my goodness. This lands right into the middle of my research. First, I'd like to say that Craig is correct, that it is fallacious to point to the growth of a particular movement as having any kind of, as indicating any kind of truth to maybe its origin story. Okay, that, all sorts of things grow. I would even flip the whole thing around. Like, what cultic movement? I mean, he calls it a movement, which is false. It's not merely a movement. It's a religious movement, a cultic movement. And we'd have to point to, okay, what other cultic religious movement was born out of anything other than legends and mythology at its root? Now, he would say that, again, you heard them say that this is because Jesus rose again and this sort of thing, and that's the claim. Well, where's the evidence of that in terms of hearing that the movement's growing, right, over the first 2 or 3 centuries? You'd think you'd just see this large lineup of individuals in the records that were, I cannot help but stand before you and confess my belief in this, and I converted because the overwhelming historiological case that's being put forward regarding Jesus' resurrection, that's the reason that I'm converting. It's just so compelling. I must, as a reasonable person, convert to this particular religion. That's just not found. We don't find that as a logical track. Certainly not the trends that they're trying to describe would be this massive exponential growth that's based on that mechanism, and yet conspicuously absent from the chronicles of early Christian texts is that mechanism. Where is it? Where are all these people that are converting because they can't help but be overwhelmed with this case? It's just not what's going on. And you've got the earliest cult fashioning itself as a cult, using the same kind of cultic forms that were present at that time, competing alongside the other cults in the major urban centers of the Roman world. It's not trying to distinguish itself in those ways. It's offering itself as a competitive franchise within the marketplace of other cultic ideas. And in that sense, Alex is correct that it really is a fledgling movement until you get to the Christianization of the Roman world under Theodosius in the late 3rd century, and you go back to Constantine and this kind of stuff that's going on. Once you get the converts occurring at the aristocratic level and the senatorial level, and then Caesar and so forth, so on and so forth, and then it becomes litigated. The Christian message becomes all but enforced. It becomes the state-sanctioned religion. Now, you got to think in terms of the Roman mind at that time, religion and state were not separated for them. And so whatever the state-sanctioned religion was, you were supposed to line up with that. It was not on the table for you to entertain ideas of diverting from that a whole lot. It was considered one and the same. That's the majestas of the empire, the majesty of the empire. Your allegiance to that, your fidelity to that is expressed through, in part or in large part, towards your deference to the state-sanctioned cult. And once Christianity became that cult, then yes, that from then on, it goes from being a fledgling, struggling, competitive kind of system or cultic community or set of communities to becoming this huge world religion that, towards becoming the huge world religion that we later know in medieval. And the growth of Christianity can be described on a number of different mechanisms, and we can get into what and why. But it wasn't because there was this great, one-of-a-kind resurrection tale that was being told that had all of this, that was structured by historiological cases, this kind of thing. That just wasn't there. The apotheosis tradition at that time, you could go to Arnobius. He's around 300. He says, and he's an apologist. He's one of the best apologists of that century, of that time. He says that, you set up couches and temples and so forth to Romulus, and you claim that he was seen after his death and so forth, and that he ascended to heaven. And so basically, then why are you upset with us, and on what basis we do the same thing with our hero? And so at that point, they still, even by the 3rd century, they still were not creating this special pleading case in that way regarding Jesus' divinity with respect to his post-mortem appearances, ascension, and so forth. All of that was still seen as part of the stock mythological kind of brain of antiquity generally, and not something special or distinctive with Christianity.
We actually have 11 eyewitnesses to the Mormon golden plates, whose names and written testimonies we still have today. 3 of those witnesses say that they saw the angel Moroni give Joseph Smith the plates with their own eyes. And even when they fell out with Joseph Smith and left the church, they still continued to assert that they had witnessed these events. We don't have anything like this kind of extant written testimony for the resurrection of Jesus.
Kevin Harris and I did a Reasonable Faith podcast on this question recently, and I think the very simple answer is that Joseph Smith and these early witnesses were charlatans. I'm sure that Alex would agree with that assessment, that these men were not sincerely mistaken that they had seen the golden plates. Rather, they were just lying about what they saw. I think that is the correct and plausible explanation of this circumstance. But notice, that explanation, when you try to carry it over to the first disciples of Jesus, it becomes completely untenable. No scholar today would support the old deistic theory that the earliest disciples stole the body of Jesus and then lied about the resurrection appearances. So while this alternative, or explanation rather, is plausible for these Mormon witnesses, I think it would be completely untenable with regard to the earliest disciples of Christ.
There's 2 excellent articles and podcasts on this in the Mormon Research Ministry that Bill McKeever has put together. And he basically really summed this up well. He said, Mormons believe the 11 witnesses saw the golden plates with their natural eyes. But a careful reading of Mormon documents themselves actually reveals a different account. According to Doctrine and Covenants, the only way these so-called witnesses could be allowed to see the plates was with faith. Faith was a prerequisite to seeing them, which is interesting. There's deep contradictory evidence, whether it was with their natural or, quote, spiritual eyes, meaning it seems to be the claims are more of a vision than empirically, so to speak. So David Whitner himself said, "We did not touch nor handle the plates." So Bill McKeever concludes, and he has a very careful article. He cites all the early sources themselves. We can link to this. I'd invite viewers to go watch it. His conclusion is, while the 11 witnesses, claimed to have handled what they were told were ancient plates, they did so while the plates were covered up and not visible. If Mormons want to insist that a person can't be considered an eyewitness to the authenticity of the golden plates unless they actually saw them, then there were no eyewitnesses to Joseph Smith's gold plates. I think that really captures it.
Wow. So they're willing, it's easy to look at another religion and see its fraudulent origins. This is, everybody in their religion sees the fraudulence in the other one, right? And that's cheap and easy, and it's commonplace. It's a tendency, right?
It's a dishonest tendency, really, in so many ways. Now, there's a number of things we can say here. People talk about the sincerity of the early Christians, the earliest Christians, the founding cult members, this kind of thing. I'd just question, what founding cult member would you trust ever in any period in history? I just want to put that out there as a question. I'm not going to answer it, but I'll just let that sit for a minute. There's this kind of no true Scotsman kind of mentality that you get with William Lane Craig. No good scholar, or no scholar alive today, this kind of thing, keep saying these kind of things. No, there's plenty of scholars alive today that talk about the missing body as a possible hoax or something that the disciples stole the body. This is still a going kind of hypothesis that is out there. I think it's maybe even the strongest one. I've got that same perspective myself. I mean, it's the easiest kind of explanation. It's interesting that the cult members are the ones that are controlling that story. In fact, to become an apostle, according to Luke, you had to bet somebody that supposedly had an appearance or that saw the appearance, right? And so they're controlling the message. They've got a set of people that are the certified envoys. It's another word for apostle. We probably need to get rid of all the sacred language because, apostolos was not a sacred term in ancient Greek. But it gets used as a particular office for this early kind of movement. And these are kind of the Amway salesmen or whatever. They're the people that are going out, giving the message, and they're the certified kind of reps that get to go traveling and present the cultic belief system and so forth. And it just so happens that those are the ones that happen to have that had these appearance stories. They're the ones that are certified to make these claims, right? And so it's interesting the kind of the controls on that message as it goes forward. And it talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, the 500 that supposedly saw him. And I think they'll probably get to that at some year. But again, they're unnamed. It's sort of left nebulous. It's telling that you would think that people outside of for the earliest, say, 3 centuries, that you'd think there would be these people outside of the Christian tradition who are talking about, well, let's go the earliest, like say the 1st century or first 100 years. So we'll say 50 to 150 or something like this, or 180 or something. Now, who are these people that are outside of the Christian cult that are saying that this is an honest and sincere movement that has a correct kind of recollection of the past? Who are they? It's only the internal, that's their internal voice, their internal kind of idea that they're talking about. And even that we can nuance that quite a bit because they're allegorizing, they're symbologizing, they're creating texts left and right. It's kind of a Willy Wonka factory of texts that are, just coming from all directions, and it's uncontrolled largely for those first couple centuries. And so this idea then, and the critics that are standing there that are willing to voice that, hey, call this what it is, they're seeing charlatanism in it. If you go look at Lucian, he describes this as a charlatan movement with gullible people and leaders that are defrauding people. And so that's his external vivid kind of impressions that he's getting, and he's in Syria, so he's right there in the stomping grounds of all this. He's seen it all grow up right around him, and he's somebody that's willing to write scathing critiques of that and publish them. So you can go back and read that. His Passing of Peregrine, it has all sorts of stuff in there that's fun to read, and that's his natural reflections on it. He's not singling out Christianity either. He's got all sorts of targets for his criticisms throughout ancient society. But that's one of them that he points out. They're pretending to be persecuted, that they're intentionally getting themselves into jail so they can, draw on the sympathies of other people, that their leaders are intentionally crafting and cooking up texts to deceive people and this kind of thing, and that it is a movement that's happy to receive anyone who's particularly skilled at that sort of fraudulence as their leader. Other kind of Tacitus, you could go around and just kind of look plenty. None of them have a flattering picture of what's happening in these earliest stages. And these are their natural impressions. These aren't, this isn't demon fueled kind of reflections on what's happening there. These are people that are, especially from the legal side, trying to understand this concerning movement as it rises, and that's causing riots and fires and disruptions, and whose leader was prosecuted for crimes in Jerusalem and executed for instigating violence there. And so this idea then that this is just this genuine, sincere movement, and that Mormonism was all just kind of cooked up out of nowhere, this is just their myth within their own minds that they're kind of proposing. It has really no particular ground in antiquity and ancient study from everything I've seen.
But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things.
Okay, it gets a bit speculative here. Scholarly consensus is that the earliest gospel, Mark, was written around 70 AD. This is some 40 years after Jesus died, and likely after the death of most of the eyewitnesses, given life expectancy in the ancient world. But even if it were written earlier, even if it were written by Mark himself, we're talking about the resurrection here. And notice that the earliest version of Mark's Gospel does not contain any descriptions of post-resurrection appearances. It ends with the empty tomb and a disappeared Jesus, and suggests that he will appear to people, but it doesn't record those appearances. So even if it's written by an eyewitness, it doesn't report anything about the resurrected Jesus. The most numerous and detailed post-resurrection appearances of Jesus are in the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John. Scholarly consensus states this to somewhere between 90 and 100 AD.
What do we make of the lack of the resurrection appearances in Mark? And then the numerous and detailed appearances in John? And then if you like, we can come back to it, but are the Gospels written in the lifetime of eyewitnesses who could have actually fact-checked them?
Mark clearly knows of resurrection appearances of Jesus in Galilee, for he has the angel say to the women at the empty tomb, "Go and tell Peter and his disciples that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him." So, if Mark's gospel does end at chapter 16, verse 8, Mark doesn't care to tell us the story of that appearance, but he knows of such a Galilean appearance. Now, in Matthew's gospel, Matthew does provide such a story of the appearance to the disciples in Galilee. So I'm not really sure what Alex's point here is supposed to be. Mark's gospel provides very early testimony to the facts of Jesus' empty tomb, to an appearance of Jesus to the disciples in Galilee, and to the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. So what's the problem? I don't think that Alex appreciates how incredibly narrow the window of opportunity is for legend to arise. Consider by contrast, the earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch some 400 years after Alexander's death. And yet classical historians still regard these as largely reliable accounts of the life and doings of Alexander. By contrast, in the Gospels, here we have narratives of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection within the first generation after his death. This is far too narrow a window of opportunity for significant accrual of legend in this regard, while eyewitnesses were still alive and the apostles were in control of the testimony of Jesus.
Oh, wow. So so I'm going to unpack this in a way that may be different than most of the people are used to in this discussion. First off, it doesn't matter if, John some of the gospel of John may have been written by John. It's almost irrelevant to the discussion. He may have written it while he was sitting on Jesus' lap, for all I care. It just that does not change the mode of the story at all. That has to be understood based upon the modal signals in the text itself and what it's directing the reader to read it a certain way. And so the proximity of these guys to what maybe happened or didn't happen almost becomes irrelevant in that way. This is a myth factory from the beginning, and Papias calls it as such. He says there's text that's out of control, the texts that are being produced. And I would even put Papias as fairly early, maybe around 100. Most people push it out a little further. I'm okay with it being early. And he's describing the prolific amount of texts that are bubbling up in all directions in this early Christian movement, the bulk of which he says is not useful to him in terms of his content. He's trying to pull together of valid anecdotal stories about Jesus and this kind of thing. Well, Eusebius goes back and reads Papias and calls it all nonsense, that he's pulled together those, he says it's mythological material, fables, and strange stories and bad theology and this kind of thing. It's kind of the description Eusebius gives. Well, I would say that that's kind of the recipe for all of the earliest Christian, right? If he's getting the best from the earliest, the people right at the spigot there in Hierapolis, and that's the recipe as it's understood later, well, I would say that that's the recipe for all of them. That's the best that was available at that time. And so this idea that there was all of this pure history writing and all of this rigor around all of that early on, we just don't see it. You get this funny claim at the beginning of Luke, but then it's not litigated at all throughout the rest of the text. He brings forth no eyewitnesses, doesn't weigh any competing accounts, doesn't have any kind of rigor around disclosing any of his research methods or any of that. He just says that all of my sources are impeccable. Here we go, and leaves all of that hidden away. And so that's not a qualified history work either.
Alex O'Connor was saying, if you play in the sandbox of eyewitnesses, if you grant authenticity of claims of eyewitnesses, whether you think they're authentic and they really are real, Alex is saying even our earliest accounts missing the ending, and there is no appearances. So you could say he was supposed to meet them, but you don't have an appearance, right? So just using that, William Lane Craig doesn't get what Alex is trying to say, which means he's not putting on his cap to understand Alex, I don't think. But the other thing, these are two red flags. There's that. Love to hear your comments on. The other thing that I think you are probably one of the number one people I'd want to hear the answer from is William Lane Craig throughout Alexander the Great, 400 years. But we could trust that one. But there's not enough time for legend to develop here with Jesus and the Gospels within decades. I'm thinking Peregrinus, Lucian made up the story about the falcon.
There's a whole bunch of stuff to say about that. I mean, he had Callisthenes, Alexander did, his traveling mythographer with him that was on the payroll to create mythology about him as a demigod. And so he's got this guy on the payroll going with him, and we don't have the text surviving. And that's another kind of problem. William Lane Craig, not a historian, he's a theologian of sorts, kind of an apologetic theologian. But if you go back into those sources, you've got Pompeius Trogus, you've got Cetyrus. These are 3rd century BC, 2nd century BC sources that predate the ones that Arian and so forth that he's pulling from there, Plutarch and so forth. And so if you go back, you see that in their sources before them too. And so, some of this is lost in the fragmentary sands of time, but yeah, he had a guy right on the payroll. You've got Damas, following around with Apollonius, writing his mythography. You've got people. And so when you get to the idea of an apotheosis, well, that often was same day or next day or that same week. It's part of the funerary consecration often. This idea that you had an appearance of this person or you saw them ascend to heaven and sworn testimony and this kind of thing, or road appearances and this sort of thing. These were tropes. It's not just one or two instances of this. These are patterns that you see across the apotheosis and larger translation fable tradition of antiquity. And in my own book, not to plug that here necessarily, but that's a thorough investigation of that. And so if you want to get into, what happened with Romulus on the road and the road encounters with, Julius Proculus and this kind of thing in that tradition, far more famous and important than when the Gospels came out. Far more. Jesus was a nobody. Romulus founded the whole empire of the modern, of that civilized world. And he had temples established in most of the major urban centers at that time. And these stories, the historians were obliged. Now, this is happening in historiography, is including these stories in there. Unlike the Christian tale, you don't get any historiography for the first few centuries of the Christian movement. They're too busy creating fables and creating, novelistic fictions and biographical, fantasies and legendizing their own kind of apostles and founding figures and creating ideological mythology. They're not interested in creating histories. There aren't any historians in the, that are producing histories of any of this stuff. And so this idea that there are all these eyewitnesses that are available to corroborate all of this, first, travel was hard. So what Paul's saying in Corinth, hey, many are still alive today. What are they going to do? Go get on the boat and go talk to these people? Where that's just a blank statement that he makes there. That's almost like a bluff in some ways. But he's talking to people that are already in a world that was bustling with apotheosis legends and traditions about people seeing each other in that way and having appearances. And so this idea of having that Jesus is sui generis and that he's not in Corinth. And the people that were converting in Corinth aren't coming there because this story was one of a kind in that way. They had other features of Christianity that they probably liked that drew them there, but it wasn't because that this one claim had so much clout to it and the others didn't. That we just don't see that unpacked at all. And so he's having so I would even say also that in there it says that according to the scriptures, that's also, I think, it's a poor translation. Scripture is a very theologically charged word, and it's very specific to canon and all these kinds of things that were not in their minds whatsoever at that time. Certainly not in Corinth, certainly not with graphe, the Greek term that's being used there. It's a very general term. It's not a religious technical term. And so it's just the writings, tas graphos, kata tas graphos. So it's just the writings. So, and that was a way to quote something. That formula there, if you look in LSJ, is a formulaic in terms of quotation and citation for a prior text. And he says, I received, I passed on to you what I received. Basically, these texts, I would say that we're only getting a small part of the larger kind of body of texts that were bubbling up at that time. And there were texts even earlier still. And so I'll grant that very early on that people were making these claims about Jesus. I would be surprised if it was not within the first year after he died, maybe even the first week. That would make sense to me because that's what we see with other apotheosis and translation legends. And so why not? That's the time when people are reflecting on that this guy died. That's the time when his body went missing. And that's the time when they would have, concocted the story more or less. And so if you look at the passing of Peregrinus, you brought that one up. That's extra fun as well and instructive. Peregrinus, who was formerly a leader of the Christian movement, a writer even, one of the top writers, the second Christ, I think it even says there. The story gets introduced early on that Lucian claims that he, made up the story and passed it to somebody. Next thing you know, that little ember had fanned into a giant flame of storytelling about, and then next thing you know, they're seeing him at the portico of the Seven Voices there in Attis, right along, is right at where all the major temples to all the major Greek gods are at there in the city and Olympus, and basically saying they saw him fresh as daisies there alive, walking the very next day, right after he had burned alive in front of a crowd to death. And so and they also have an ascension kind of description there as well. And this is all within the same funerary consecration of this guy. It's within the same hours and maybe a day later. And so this idea then that we just don't have enough time to create legends. The Caesars walked the earth and legends were written about them in their lifetimes. You could read Ovid about Augustus and so forth. Those legends were percolating right around these figures, even while they were still alive. And so it wouldn't take much after that and we can just go on and on. You'll have to look at my book, and you have, Derek, you've read it cover to cover. And so But that's just a falsehood that's being retrojected back onto it. It's a convenient kind of argument that there needs to be this long period of time that legends to be created. No, the legendization of individuals, the heroes in that time period in the Roman world, was often instant and immediate, and within within the time frames that we see with the New Testament Gospels.
Bill, I'm curious if you have a theory or an opinion about why Mark doesn't explicitly include these appearances. And in part, for me, it's clear Mark 8, 9, and 10, he predicts his death. He has predictions of his resurrection. Yeah. And my best guess is that Mark is kind of setting this up, saying, now what are you going to do about it? We've made it clear who Jesus is. Now anticipating his appearance, which by the time Mark was written, everybody would have known the story itself. It's almost like a challenge to the readers. What are you going to do with this pending appearance claim that's coming? Do you have an opinion on that at all?
I don't have a strong opinion because it is so perplexing that the story just breaks off after verse 8. But I think what you've suggested is not implausible. And it does leave the reader confronted with the question of how he's going to respond to this. But the key point, I think, is the one that you just made, namely, for Mark's readership and audience, they know what he's talking about. This is written ex post facto. So it shows that Mark knows there was at least one Galilean appearance of Jesus, such as Matthew relates. And so you have evidence in the Gospel of Mark for the honorable burial, the discovery of the empty tomb, a resurrection appearance to the disciples, and the origin of the disciples' faith. That's the heart of the case for the resurrection of Jesus.
Very painful. And so, that was my article in JBL so many years ago, that, the translation fable and basically the missing body as a signal, that Mark's ending is profound and complete all in itself. Now, they added more to it as a matter of accretion, apological accretion. And you see that throughout. You got the short and long endings, the added endings to Mark. You get more endings if you want to see Matthew as kind of Mark plus, Mark plus some things. And that carries forward with the other Gospels. They even be outside of the canon as well. This is, there's kind of embellishing and growing. It's a fish story, and so to speak. There's putting more on this. But this idea, though, that somehow indicates that there's a reality behind the story. No, that the translation fable as a legend was well known at that time, and how that would have been processed in the minds of people in that world would have been fairly clear, that this is cult crafting. This is the way you this is the way you honor someone, by giving them bestowing these kind of ornaments on their story, a decorative frame. Divine birth was the other kind of side of that frame. When you put out somebody's life that way, did they have one divine parent and one human parent, this kind of thing. And this is the way you embellish the lives of kind of Hall of Fame figures in antiquity. And so so the missing body would have signaled an apotheosis, kind of like what you get with Calero, this kind of thing. And in so many other texts, I think there's like 50 something in my gallery in the book of missing body legends, and that signaled deification. And so the idea that he's saying he's going to have an appearance somewhere, well, that's a theophany. That's an epiphany. That was a well-entrenched idea in the classical Roman world. And so this idea that is somehow supposed to create that, what are you going to do about this? Well, you're going to participate in a cult. That's what you're going to do about it. You're not going to think that this is some kind of this unique claim that has no peers or precedents or anything like that. That's not what would have been going on in their minds at that time, even though that clearly is what's going on in the minds of these two gentlemen here. this was all in continuity with the standing kind of inventory or grammar of how you would celebrate an individual who was to be exalted to divinity in literature. And so that they're implying, they're deploying those protocols within Mark in order to signal that. And so
it's painful to in some ways, because it's sort of like it's an effort to make a case for their religion rather than a genuine investigation into the mind and world of antiquity. And so that's kind of where you get the disjunct between what you're hearing from them and what you're hearing from me. I really want to understand how this would have landed in the ancient mind. And we see that when we go back into the ancient texts. Yeah, they were creating cults and crafting stories to be believed. This isn't a knowledge system. This is a belief system, something you were to indulge yourself in, just like any of the other cults. If you go down the lane, you walk into the cult of Heracles, their temple there, like say in Corinth. Oh, well, sit down and immerse yourself in these stories would have been kind of the idea there, and celebrate this heroic figure and so forth. His memory in legend. And so, the earliest Christians, like you get with Justin Martyr, this idea that these are memoirs, the Gospels are memoirs of the apostles. You go back to the actual language of that. What is it? It's aponema pneumata, I think it's on apostolum. And so these are the memorials of the apostles. Well, you get that with other legend making as well. That same kind of language is described regarding the legends of Isis in Egypt, where she supposedly introduced to them grain and barley and this kind of thing. And you get this in Diodorus. He gives this in book 1, this idea that, that these are ways to celebrate the memory of these particular tales within cultures in cities. And Isis and Osiris were huge in Egypt, as you probably know. And so, the same thing's going on here. They're giving elevated memories. Exaltatio memoria is what's happening in these texts. It's the opposite of damnatio memoria. And we have to see that vis-a-vis the Caesars in so many ways. And the elevation of particular iconified figures in antiquity and story embellishment that goes with that. And so this is the way that they would craft a legend around a particular figure. And it just so happens, as a point of accident, we have Mark being written at some point around 70. Well, that becomes a platinum hit. I think the religion took off with that in so many ways because it was such it registered so clearly within the larger Roman world that, hey, this is a hero from the East. And that got people excited. Next thing you know, there's other gospels that are imitating. They were kind of obliged, hey, let's use that one in ours too, and kind of play on it and freely kind of craft our own idea around it. And so Mark gets pulled into all sorts of other, both canonical and non-canonical texts, that we shouldn't even be thinking about those categories at that time. But they're producing texts around that because of its popularity as a legend text. You get in Luke this idea of Theophilus. I think oftentimes it's described, that the text is written to Theophilus at the beginning of the text. Well, that's a lover of gods. It'd be kind of like dog lover, if you've, oh, dog lover, so it's a text that has that kind of playful appeal to it that like, hey, you like gods? Let me show you one more, this kind of thing. And so, you like dogs? Let me show you one more, this kind of thing. And so that's the way, if you look at kind of that kind of construct there at the beginning of it, it's trying to make an appeal to a reader to, hey, make overtures to that kind of sentimentality regarding belief in the deities. And here's one more that has a special kind of place that should be on your shelf as well. And so, I don't know. I think they want to read back into this early incepted movement a sort of structure and clear argumentation that
bolsters their own religious kind of anxiety around, the leap of faith that they've made. This is not a knowledge system, and you can't argue your way back into some clear picture of what happened that's going to lead you to where they're at. And so that's problematic for them. And so they want to pass it off as a knowledge system. But the irony is that were they to succeed in that, they'd fall out of faith. They would have a knowledge system. They would no longer be believers. They would be knowers. And at that point, they would fall out of salvific grace. And so sola fide, that's the irony, the ironic kind of tragedy for the apologists.
How significant is the dating of the Gospels for your case for the resurrection? Is it important that we get like Mark in the 40s or 50s, as some maybe try to Mark you? If it was in the 70s, would it really not affect kind of the core case that you're making for the resurrection?
No, it doesn't. You notice is the way I stated it just now. I said that these narratives go back to within the first generation after the events, which is extraordinary for ancient history. So we can accept that Mark was written around AD 70, Luke, Acts around 70 to 80, Matthew around AD 80. That still is within that narrow time frame that I described. Now, personally, though, Sean, I find the arguments that the book of Acts was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 to be almost compelling.
Oh, wow.
It seems to me that the conspiration of independent lines of evidence, all pointing to Acts, having been written before AD 70, is very powerful. And since Luke was written prior to Acts, that would mean that Luke was written then prior to AD 70. And if Luke used Mark, then Mark was written even earlier. And so I think this does push the dates back even further to narrow that window of opportunity for legendary development to an even more impossible narrowness.
Oh, wow. Okay, so there's more going on here. Again, it's kind of like just reading the evidence toward whatever bolsters their religious claims the most. And they get excited about that the most. Now, as a historian myself, that I don't care if Mark sat on Jesus' lap and wrote Mark. Again, going back to John, sitting on Jesus. If you go back far enough, there's this idea you got Mark wrote from his recollections of Peter's kind of sermons and stuff like this. Okay, well, this is a cult leader, a guy that might have had some memory of, if we grant that in Papias, this is, and Eusebius, and so that he had, Irenaeus and these kind of characters are trying to draw these apostolic lines so that you've got this living memory that somehow is recorded in these texts to some extent. Now, they're also at the same time going as fast as possible toward allegorical readings and running away from that in so many ways. And so you get that with Origen, especially running as fast as he can from historically kind of grounded, faithful kind of perspective in terms of what he's doing there. But it's almost irrelevant if you've got people writing myths early on. Heck, it might have Jesus himself. I'm sure was a myth maker if he existed in history, and I think he did. I'm sure he was operating from a standpoint of myth as kind of the figurehead of that movement. That would make perfect sense. And so the idea that everybody's just talking about ontological reality and the Gospels are, raw footage of what took place there is ridiculous. These are grown adults. And so at what point, are you going to read the, 1001 Nights and start believing that blind carpets are real and genies and this kind of thing? I do want to poke some fun at that because of the outlandishness of what we're getting in the New Testament regarding Jesus. It's absurd
from a humanistic standpoint to vest that with credibility, and no other accounts anywhere else. All other religions were started from nonsense and fraudulence and myth making and cultic, imagination and figmentation and this kind of thing. But this one is founded on this kind of genuine live footage of what took place. It's insane. And so that said, the idea that you've got Mark written in 70, that's established. I don't know a lot of people that are only the most strident religionist is really pushing for something earlier than that I'm aware of anyway. It's just, it feels absurd to try and push it before that because of some of the markers that are in the text with the temple of destruction and all that. But if you go out to Papias, he doesn't know about any of these other gospels. He doesn't know about John. He doesn't know about Matthew either. He mentions that a disciple named Matthew wrote down a series of sayings, logia, not a narrative, and that it's been poorly translated from some sort of Hebrew dialect, probably Aramaic, up to that point in various ways, poorly translated. People have struggled to translate it in different ways. And so I'll grant that. Okay, one of Jesus' students wrote down some of his adages and sayings and this kind of thing. And maybe some of that even made its way into what we now call the canonical Matthew. But that's fine. That does not, you've gone no distance at that point toward absolving it of its mythological kind of signals within the text. That's still the operative kind of framework, and you're still dealing with a cultic movement within cultic communities within the urban centers of the Roman world that's fashioning itself as a competitive cult. They're singing hymns. They're talking about their hero as being divine, just like other heroes in antiquity were also demigod and divine. They're having hymns, they're, meeting and doing worship and psalms and this kind of thing. And this idea then that they've got this really happened message that they want to distinguish from everyone else. Well, they're sure not doing a whole lot to demonstrate that to anyone by trying to couch it within the existing conventionality of ancient cultic communities. And so if I saw someone actually fly into the air to go fly prime, the last thing I'd do is produce a comic book about it. That would not be my natural reaction. And that's kind of what they're doing here, is they're putting it within, stylizing the earliest legends within the kind of the mythic furniture of that time period, and creating a cult and advertising it as such, and creating and getting converts to that cult to operate within the standing kind of forms and structures in conventionality of that time period in late antiquity and the Roman world. And so so if you say Papias doesn't know about the other gospels, that means they probably weren't written yet. And so you also have Clement of Rome, who doesn't know about the other gospels. He knows about Mark. He quotes Mark, and he quotes a few of these sayings that we find vestiges of in Matthew, but he doesn't know about the larger kind of M material, the bookends of Matthew, the larger mythological kind of additives that Matthew brings as in the canonical form that we know. He only knows a few of these extra sayings, and he knows Mark, and this is around 90. So you could make a case that they wrote earlier and just hid the text somewhere in in a jar or something like that, and didn't bring it out until around 100. But I think I land with other scholars that these were the best ones I know of are making a case that these texts were later. That Luke was early second century, that John was early second century, may have content that's somehow earlier than that in some funny kind of literary way. But I think that content looks a lot like what Papias describes. And that would be a lot of myth making and a lot of early kind of anecdotal cultic storytelling.
One quick point in this, I think Wes Huff's general point is that these are not events that were done just kind of out of the public eye, but these are public events that people could engage and know. And especially if you're right on the dating of Acts, Peter says in Acts 2:22, men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. That is such an interesting claim that Peter preaches this to his audience. They know it because this wasn't done in private, but done in public. I think that's the root of what Wes is getting at, which in many ways sets Christianity apart from other faiths.
Yeah. So again, Luke Acts, this is later, this idea that they've got this strong case, I would defer to the best scholars that are at Dennis MacDonald. You've got a variety of scholars out there. Richard Burlow's commentary on Acts, you've read that before. Outstanding commentary. I don't think any of these towering individuals that have spent their lives, their entire careers studying Acts, this is the best historians of our time. None of them are trying to argue that this is, a clear reflection of anything that historically happened. And so you've got myth-making, ideological legend. You've got Paul on his ship like Odysseus crossing the sea, having these episodes, and a lot of different funny little healing stories that are reminiscent of all sorts of tales like what we've seen bubbling up regarding any number of other figures. Asclepius. A lot of the content looks a lot like Pythagorean legends in terms of some of the wonder-working that goes on there. Apollonius of Tyana. So if you put this out that far, which is where it belongs, I believe, in the early 2nd century, then yeah, they're ratcheting up the claims in terms of their legend at that point and trying to make it look like, now you've got the bulldozer of the Roman Empire coming through around 68 and completely destroying and sending people fleeing often, typically from that region. What we get in Josephus in the description of, Titus and Vespasian and so forth coming through that area. And yeah, it's kind of hard. How do you go? I mean, that kind of erased the hard drive, so to speak, of that area in so many ways. The idea that then you've got these like living recollections of all these people that are still there. Well, it's just not the case. It's you're harking back to a kind of a black box of stuff there that no one knows. And you've got Acts as a legend, a set of texts that are clearly presenting legendary material and presenting the earliest kind of founding ideas within a story, within this isn't a history work. He's not bringing to bear any kind of eyewitness testimonies or any kind of prior sources he's just not providing any of the rigor that you would expect in any respected history work in that time. Instead, you've got tall tales, chapter by chapter, presented without apology. And so this idea that, and it's structuring an early cult. This isn't, going in the archive in Alexandria somewhere for serious people to look at. This is going to be read within private cultic environments for people that are trying to structure their belief system and their piety in that way. And so there's just a lot of leaps in their logic that I find ridiculous. And so gullible, I guess you could say gullible.
There are dozens of non-canonical gospels that were written but didn't make it into the New Testament for all kinds of different reasons. Listen to what Wes Huff has to say about these gospels.
And so these books that were not included, are any of them interesting? I mean,
They're all interesting.
But does any of it seem like it belongs in the New Testament?
Well, so part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books. So you do have, and some of them have an agenda to them.
Like, what? I'm just going to underline that. He just said of the non-canonical gospels.
Part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books.
The problem here is with basically the first thing that anybody learns about the New Testament. Scholars think that Mark was written first, then Matthew and Luke were written later. Why? Because Matthew and Luke are reliant on Mark. And not just a little bit. More than 90% of Mark's gospel is also in Matthew's gospel. Mark has 660 verses in total. Over 600 of them are also in Matthew, often copied verbatim. It is undisputed that there is a literary dependence between Matthew and Luke and Mark.
Again, there's a lot here, Bill, but here's the question I'd love for you to weigh in on. Is Wes right that we can dismiss the Gnostic Gospels for having an agenda and for being reliant upon earlier Gospels? What should we make of the Gnostic Gospels?
Here, I think that Alex is needlessly unsympathetic to what Wes Huff was saying. The apocryphal Gospels, things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, and so on, do not appear until the second half of the 2nd century after Christ. And they are shaped by the pagan philosophy of Gnosticism. They do not evince a genuine historical interest in Jesus of Nazareth. Rather, Jesus simply serves as a kind of sock puppet, a mouthpiece for spouting Gnostic doctrine. What historical nuggets the apocryphal Gospels do contain all come from the New Testament, which they know. So the apocryphal Gospels are not useful as sources for the life and teachings of Jesus. Now, again, I want to ask, what is Alex's point supposed to be? Surely he doesn't think that the apocryphal Gospels are reliable sources. Rather, he must think that Wes Huff's critique is correct, but that it would also invalidate the New Testament Gospels. But that inference, I think, is far too quick. Of course, the New Testament Gospels have an agenda. And of course, there are relations of dependency between them. Nevertheless, they do provide early, multiple, independent attestation to many aspects of the life of Jesus, and therefore are generally regarded as valuable historical sources for the life of Christ. To give just one illustration, take the burial narrative of Jesus, such an important event, the burial in the tomb. This is attested in the pre-Markan Passion story that Mark used in writing his gospel. It is also to be found in Matthew's special source material, that is to say, material that Matthew had that he did not derive from Mark. And it's also found in Luke's special material, that is material unique to Luke, which he did not derive from Mark or from Matthew. And then the story is also found in the Gospel of John, which is generally regarded as independent of the three synoptics. Go over to the Apostle Paul, and you find the burial mentioned in the very old tradition handed down by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. And on top of all that, the burial account is mentioned in the apostolic sermons in the Acts of the Apostles. So look what we've got here. You've got 5 or 6 independent sources for the burial account, some of which are among the most ancient, earliest materials in the New Testament. And so these are incomparably better sources than the 2nd century apocryphal gospel.
Wes Huff was on with Joe Rogan 3 hours, and Joe is admittedly not an expert in these things, and Wes is trying to popularize certain points and wasn't able to expand. So it sounded like Wes was just saying, I dismiss the Gospels because they have an agenda and they're reliant upon earlier texts. And if that's what he was saying, then Alex fairly said, wait a minute, the Gospels also have an agenda, and Matthew and Luke, for example, are reliant upon an earlier text. So I think Alex fairly said, I'm not totally sure if I'm capturing what Wes communicates here. So I literally texted Wes to make sure I was understanding what his point was. And he clarified to me that he means the Gnostic Gospels are reliant upon established canonical Gospels. But rather than bringing the same message as, for example, Matthew and Luke do with Mark, they have a Gnostic agenda of incorporating their own pagan beliefs onto the earlier texts. So the agenda of the Gospels is to proclaim who Jesus is, and the agenda of the Gnostic Gospels is to appropriate Jesus for their own theological, philosophical perspective, which was foreign to the first century Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. So I think that clarification really helps. And Wes's argument, if he's able to expand it, still stands.
Wow. That was a tour de force of insanity. So there's a number of things that they're doing there. This idea of apocryphal and Gnostic, those are like, red flags or kind of like dog whistles to that particular community that, hey, this is nonsense. Don't read any of this. And so, it's kind of a way to segregate and silo off the New Testament. It's kind of a construct that didn't exist in the earliest records. And so if we go back to Papias, he says that all sorts of texts had been written by his time at 100. So they're trying to push all this out. This is all just kind of, you kind of get this impression with them that there's just these really crazy Gnostic kind of craftsmen over in this room quickly, pumping out texts, by themselves, all in isolation, that's completely, segregated and siloed off from the rest of what they would consider to be the orthodox or right way. And that all that segregation didn't exist at that time. There were people with that sentiments about this text or that, and there are communities. If you read Irenaeus, there are different communities that are favoring texts and this kind of thing, and different texts are bubbling up in all sorts of direction. But this idea that there's this kind of pure stream of tradition coming from, of course, it would be their Bible. You notice that they never pick out a part in their particular canon that's like, oh, this also it shouldn't belong there because they're just accepting their canonical kind of sandbox that they're delivered, and everything that in it is pure gold. It's all just great material, and it's all got all of this kind of rich historical traditional underpinning to it, and everything that lands outside of that sandbox is complete crap. And so that's a picture that they're, again, retrojecting from their own theological kind of necessity, really, back into this messy world that just doesn't exist there. If you go back and read Papias, he gives us I don't think it's a purely accurate picture, but it's as close as someone from that biased perspective is going to get, or we're going to get. As an elder, or a bishop or whatever in Hierapolis, he's a major leader, and he's entrusted with this research project to create the master's sayings, or the exposition of the master's sayings rather. And so he's going back and trying his best to pull together all the best material that's there. And in his view, there's all sorts of texts by 100, all sorts of texts. Most of it is kind of the way if you read it carefully there, he's having to fish out, and he finds much of it very verbose and nonsensical and not what he wanted to select. So he's kind of cherry picking from what he sees as just kind of a heap of crazy to put together what he thinks is going to be the most valuable. And what's interesting is what he cherry picks out of there. Like I said earlier, Eusebius looks at that and says, that's crazy. And so even that, they're not, so this idea of preferencing one text over another, or thinking that one is preserving this careful memory of something, is itself crazy, I think. You've got Mark that's crafted it. Now, what there is in terms of his burial, I don't, it's almost irrelevant. Okay, he got buried. Whether that's an actual recollection of anything that's surviving that has any kind of validity to it at all. You're dealing with a cultic text that's not interested in that. If they were interested in that, they'd have competing accounts. They'd have all sorts of different kind of lenses and stuff. That's the whole idea. Historio, the verb there in Greek, actually means to go and make an investigation. It's not just to write history. It's the rigor around the investigation. That's what you're supposed to see present in the text somewhere. That rigor. And we don't get that in the Gospels. Certainly not in Mark. So he's trying to start with Mark as this great kind of preservation of something.
If it was, then you get that rigor around it. No, you're getting a demigod story about a wonder worker that is structuring cultic belief. It's a cultic text. And so, yeah, there's a tale around, and some of that verisimilitude around some of the details there is given a kind of farcical clarity. But if we'll just say Mark is hearing sermons, Peter's, let's see, it would have been a good 10 years after Mark had already been executed or something like this. So, well, let's say 5 to 10 years. Think of any sermon or message you heard 5 or 10 years ago that you have a vivid kind of memory of. Even if we grant that that's the mechanism that's going on with Mark there, which I don't think it is at all, because if he were interested in crafting that kind of text, there would be generic signals in it that would help support. So anyway, I think there's a whole number of kind of assumptions that are being made there that are driven out of a particular agenda to prop up the claims of their religion for people that either A, have already bought into it and now want to feel better about that mental kind of violation that in terms of their beliefs without direct evidence. So they're circling back to hear from Craig, give me the evidence, please, so I could feel better about this childhood decision I made, whatever. Or, it's people that are, they're trying to make sure and bolster the claims for people that might want to convert, to make them more, to present this more as a knowledge system. It's the unavoidable kind of conclusion of their thought is you must become a Christian then, which is insane. And so, go ahead.
So you fact check someone coming back from the dead.
Well,
how many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once.
West gets this slightly wrong, as Paul actually says that Jesus appeared to 500, not 400 people at one time. But this only makes it all the more amazing. 500 people witnessing the physically resurrected Jesus would be an amazing proof of his resurrection. Unfortunately, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the only mention we have of this event anywhere. It's not in the Gospels, nor in Acts, nor in any other historical source. So, what do we learn about this event from 1 Corinthians? Nothing. Nothing at all. Paul does write that, quote, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, but that's it. We're not told who these people are, or why they were gathered, or when this occurred, or how Paul learned about it, or how he knows the number of people involved. Paul himself wasn't there. Is this just something that he heard about? From whom? When? We're not told anything about this extraordinary event.
There's a lot here again, Bill, but the heart of the question is I'm really curious your take on how valuable, central, and reliable is the appearance to the 500 as cited by Paul in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed.
Certainly, it would be very nice to have multiple attestation of this appearance. But it would be a misuse of the criteria of authenticity to say that because the appearance is not multiply attested, therefore it is unhistorical. The criteria of authenticity, like multiple attestation, dissimilarity, and so forth, can only be used positively to increase the probability of some event. But obviously, being singly attested does not imply that the event, therefore, did not occur. In fact, I think that we have really good grounds for thinking that the appearance to the 500 brethren did occur, because Paul goes on to say of the 500 brethren, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. That shows that this appearance was not just a meaningless cipher for Paul. Rather, he knew the people involved, and he was aware that some of them had passed away in the interim. Paul's mentioning that some of them are still alive can only mean the witnesses are there to be questioned. Now, why don't we have then an appearance or a story of this appearance? Well, think about it with me. An appearance to 500 people at one time would have to take place out of doors. For example, perhaps on a Galilean hillside where thousands of people had gathered to hear Jesus preach during his lifetime. The Gospels tend to focus their attention on the resurrection appearances in Jerusalem as opposed to Galilee. But a provocative suggestion is that the mountaintop appearance in Galilee, narrated by Matthew, could be the appearance to the 500 brethren. One of the interesting things about Matthew's appearance story is that unlike all the other appearances, which were unexpected and caught people by surprise, is that this one was by appointment. Matthew says the disciples went to the mountain which Jesus had appointed them to go to, and there he appeared to them. And it was, of course, in Galilee that thousands of people had thronged to hear Jesus. I think it's not at all improbable that 500 people might have gathered with the disciples on that mountaintop to wait for Jesus and to experience this appearance. And so it could be that we do actually have a mention of this appearance story in the Galilean appearance story of Matthew.
As a whole, my take is there's multiple appearance accounts. We have different accounts to the women. We have accounts to the two disciples in Luke 24, the Emmaus disciples. We have multiple accounts to the disciples with Thomas, without Thomas, James, Paul, etc. And we have the 500. So it's a piece of a cumulative case, and we can make, I think Alex goes too far in saying, what do we learn from this event? Nothing at all. I think that's too skeptical. I don't think Wes, I think he was just simply citing this as, hey, do we have appearances of Jesus? Here's one example. Would have given others. So we can be too critical, but we can also be too confident in it. To me, it's a piece of a larger case that just strengthens the appearances of Jesus.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, folks need to read my book, I guess. So that's the whole, so the appearance, so you've got appearances, you've got eyewitness testimonies, you've got a son of a god, which is, that's what the Corinthian correspondence begins with, that it framed Jesus as demigod, son of God, and ends with that in chapter 16, as I recall. You're dealing with chapter 15 here, which is it's just kind of a hodgepodge of all sorts of these miscellaneous topics that he's just bebopping through in that particular correspondence. We're reading somebody else's mail. This is cultic mail that's sent from a cult leader to his cultic community. This isn't like a treatise or a case for the validity of the religion in any way. And so it's not presented that way, nor is it functioning that way in the particular text. He's trying to make a case for his community. They said that, some people rejected the idea of resurrection at all in the Corinthian community. And so he's trying to build up a kind of a rhetorical case around that. And so starts off with signals, translation signals. Those were the signature signals these are the signature traits, rather, of someone who had been translated to divinity that were well known. This wasn't special to Jesus at all. And so you've got the Caesars, you've got any number of, I've got a whole gallery of individuals, and many of them had these same Aristeas of Proconesus, had eyewitnesses, had appearances, even left a literary work. He didn't eat fish, he didn't eat broiled fish, but he left behind a literary work, which I think would be more interesting. Wouldn't that be interesting if Jesus had an appearance and then wrote something and then left it? That would be pretty interesting. But this is legend making. I mean, where's the cult? Where's the apologist for Aristeas? Let's have them on next. And I don't think the case would be weaker. It would be kind of similar. Apollonius Tyana also had, legends around him, of him having a post-mortem appearance to folks, and certainly to one disciple, and also ascending with people there, and a disappearance story as well. So there's different stories there in the legends surrounding him and how he's crafted. But when you get to the Caesars, you've got all sorts of eyewitness testimony. In fact, that's part of their funerary consecration. It's part of even like the agenda. Okay, now bring forward the witness.
Are you suggesting, Dr. Miller, that there's a likely chance that the imperial cult's model of funerary legendization, if you will, or Hall of Fame framework might have been the well-established, inventive, cultic, you think that Christianity's closer to the imperial cult? And I mean, look, commentaries on Mark, look at how close these scholars are trying to associate the imperial cult competing. Even Don Crossan, who's participating in this process, implies that much by saying you either believe in Caesar or you believe in Jesus. Well, why are they so freaking close to Caesar if they're not in some way competing? So you're suggesting Paul might actually, in these letters in 1 Corinthians 15, look, they see the big boy on the block. They know Augustus, the Pax Romana. They know the Caesars are claiming to be God. And here they are making their own dude the same.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, I delivered a paper at SBL that's basically unpacking the political language of that entire chapter. Now, it's not just the beginning of it, but if you go on and read throughout the rest of 1 Corinthians 15, there's a lot of political language there, especially the underlying Greek. And so it is a counterculture. It is subversive to the political powers. And they say their kingdom transcends it, but it's still aggravating. It's still vis-a-vis Caesar. He's a king nonetheless. His kingdom isn't of this world, but it's a kingdom nonetheless. And it is competing with the emperor cult and using and leveraging many of the same tropes and language around, the Filius Dei, the son of a god. Jesus is being bestowed on him in his kind of kingly vesture that's given there. Of course, he's a suffering king, and so his crown of thorns. But it's offensive to Roman sensibilities, and they're not burning incense to Caesar. If you go back and read the martyrdom of Polycarp or these early accounts, they're taking a hard stand vis-a-vis the political structure of that time and getting in trouble for it. And so they're considered troublemakers in that way. And so if you go and actually do the research and look at how it's being perceived by the Roman government and magistrates and local officials and all of this, it's perceived as dangerous vis-a-vis the Roman government. And so problem in that way. And a lot of it comes down to not, hey, do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? That particular kind of narrative, which is presented often, is like why they were executed here and there within the earliest, the first 2 centuries. It's just, you just don't find it. What you find is, I refuse to burn incense to Caesar, and this kind of thing. And so, I refuse to, abandon this religion that it was founded by someone that was executed prosecuted under Roman law as a criminal. And so it's seen as dangerous in that way. Imagine a movement today that starts up and there's a craze about it, and it's founded by someone that was executed for crimes by the government. That the government would keep a close eye on that movement, right? Oh, you mean we didn't end the movement with the execution of the leader? Where's this going? And so they were watching it very carefully and making sure, and to not burn incense to Caesar was the same thing as saying, I'm not going to kiss your scepter. I am defiant of the Roman kind of pietas at that time. And so it was seen as a political affront and a subversive gesture. And so, yes, it's vis-a-vis empire all over the place. And the appearance stories and appearance narratives, the eyewitness testimony, this is lifted straight out of the Roman Imperial Cult and the funerary consecration of the Caesars, and with all kinds of antecedents. You can go back to Romulus and all the way back. a Heracles even with missing bones and all this stuff. And it's signaling all of that in their minds. You got to read. One of the things I've heard, or like, I can't remember the McDowell, is that the other fellow's name here? This idea that they were trying to, I don't know, structure a particular argument around beliefs that would make sense to him in that way. I think he's reading back into it his own kind of theological needs, and not seeing where were the actual. He says that, well, this isn't the way this would have landed in Second Temple Judaism. Well, these texts aren't written for, found traction within Second Temple Judaism. That's not where this is happening. These are written in by if there is a consensus among us, we're pretty much across the board. There might be some strange holdout or some strange other person with a theory that's out there. I'm not aware of it. Most people are saying that these are written in the Romans, urban centers, and certainly being consumed in those centers. And certainly we find the earliest evidence of their success in those centers of the Roman urban world. And so this idea that that's the context, he almost imagined that's the context for a letter written to Corinth. It says where it's written to, And so we know that we can study Corinth and know that context in the linguistic, cultural mindset of people that are sitting in that city. This is a metropolis, a highly Hellenistic metropolis in the ancient world. It's I think it's the third largest city in the Roman world. It's huge in terms of its population. It's like maybe 1 million people living within a 5 or 6 square mile area that had been swimming in these kinds of legends for a long, long, long time. They had a whole lane there dedicated to, with different structured temples to each of the Caesars up to that point. And so Pausanias describes that in vivid detail. And so that's the world that they had been swimming in, that they saw every day in front of them, where translation legends and eyewitness testimonies were rife. That's the context. And so 500 that saw him, we may as well have said 1 million people saw him. That doesn't, you're still talking about a cult that's making claims that's vis-a-vis these other cultic claims. And so, yeah, they could say, you could see it kind of begin. It's to Cephas, so it's one guy, happens to be the principal cult leader, right? And then it's to the 12. Okay, they're fanning the flame. And then it's to 500. You could see the flame just grew from, boom, this huge amount of people. And well, that's a lot like what you see going on with Proteus peregrinus, with the fish story that grew up out of just the lightest little whisper of a tall tale at the beginning. And next thing you know, you've got an entire group of people buying into these stories. And so, yeah.
And even if the 500 people did all believe it was Jesus, how many of them were already predisposed to think this? Remember, sometimes groups do claim to see visions, such as various apparitions of Mary, or the Roman Emperor Constantine's vision of a cross of light in the sky, which may have been seen by his whole army as well. The source isn't clear. Look at this image. This is a picture of a crowd in Fatima, Portugal in 1917. This crowd, many more than 500 in number, were witness to the so-called miracle of the sun. A prophecy by 3 shepherd children said that the Virgin Mary would perform a miracle on the 13th of October, causing this large crowd to gather on that day. And the miracle happened. Testimonies from the members in the crowd were published in the newspaper. They claimed to have seen the sun dancing in the sky, zigzagging around, and even advancing towards the earth, all for 10 minutes. So a large crowd witnessing a prophesied miracle, and we actually know who saw it and precisely what they saw. We even have their direct testimony. Does Wes Huff believe in this Catholic miracle? Do you? And if not, why not?
So I'm really curious your take. How do we respond to group visions of the Virgin Mary?
I think here Alex is drawing our attention to a very important point, namely the antecedent beliefs of persons which would dispose those persons towards certain experiences. Like Alex, I am skeptical of the Marian mass appearances. The person who experiences Marian visions are typically Roman Catholics predisposed toward belief in the Virgin Mary. And so for exactly the same reason, I wouldn't lay too much emphasis on the appearance to the 500 brethren, who were probably all Christians. It's interesting that Paul refers to them as brethren, 500 brethren. So these people were probably already Christian believers, and therefore predisposed to believe in Jesus' resurrection. And so I wouldn't lay too much emphasis on this. As you said, Sean, it's a piece in the puzzle. It's part of the cumulative case. I think the really important appearances are the appearances to Peter and to the 12. These early appearances were completely contrary to antecedent Jewish beliefs, which predisposed them not to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. One of the most remarkable things about the belief in the resurrection of Jesus is that the earliest disciples who suddenly and sincerely came to this belief were predisposed by their first century typical Jewish thought forms completely against it. And so this is one of the major factors crying out for explanation with respect to the resurrection of Jesus. What N.T. Wright has called these mutations in Jewish belief about the resurrection that were necessitated by believing in Jesus rising from the dead. This is not a natural evolution of antecedent Judaism.
Now, if I understand Alex's reasoning correctly, he's saying, if we have this appearance of the 500, then we would need to adopt these Catholic visions of Mary. And since many people don't accept those, we should question the 500. I would say, well, all right, if we accept the 500 and be consistent in his eyes and accept the Marian apparitions, then you and I, Bill, would just need to maybe consider becoming Catholic, but he would need to completely shift his worldview and open it up to the supernatural, which would be far more jarring to him than it would be to you and me. But nonetheless, I think you're absolutely right. The predisposition changes everything. I think it's fascinating. We look at the accounts of the disciples, like Mary sees Jesus, doesn't really understand, like what is going on when they view him. The disciples on Emmaus, even when Jesus is there, they don't understand. So they're predisposed to the opposite. And you and I have to explain the apologetic question. If that really was Jesus, why didn't they believe? And so I think that predisposition, when you're told ahead of time, there will be this supernatural event, everybody shows up in a group. I think we have an adequate explanation for this that doesn't apply to the apostles.
Oh my goodness. So there was some parts of that made some sense in terms of being predisposed to believe things. People believe crazy things. And I know on your show, Derek, that you investigated a lot of that, not just the Christian religion, but all sorts of religions. And so we are dealing with a religion here, a religious cult. Its beginnings, its cult leaders, this kind of thing that's being taken on the road, so to speak, the mission to the ethne. Even in Matthew, it says, take this, it's in the Great Commission, which is a lot like the Great Commission given in Romulus, or by Romulus in Livy. Go ye therefore into all the world and, present this message to all the ethne. And this is in his appearance legend in Matthew. And so, and it is mimetic. It's following that of Romulus. It's Romulian in that way. And there were all sorts of antecedents. So putting this as an expectation, a Roman, Hellenistic, I'll even grant Jewish expectation with certain Hellenistic Jews. What does Josephus do with Moses? You pointed this out, and I pointed it out as well. He completely, here's somebody that's dedicated to Judaism in many, 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 many ways, and he's presenting the ideological, the ancient stories of his own people, his own religion, to the larger Roman world. in his Antiquities of the Jews, and he decides to make Moses, instead of God burying Moses, he has him ascend to heaven at the end of his career there as an apotheosized Moses, right? And so why does he do that? He takes liberty with the most sacred figure of his own religious system. You would think that would be a non-negotiable. Like, you can't, and he does that without even the slightest concern. He doesn't have any explanation for, he doesn't help any of his Jewish brethren to like come along with him on that. He just like lays it down right at the end. We're going to change the story because we need to gentrify this for a Roman kind of world. Because if we don't put this at the end of his story, Moses is a nobody. He can't compete alongside the other figures in that world who ascended left and right. And so the most important iconified figures of that world had ascension narratives and had divine birth narratives and this sort of thing. And he doesn't do that with the birth necessarily, but he does create, he's happy to bring forward the fable that you get, or the origin story from Moses there with the basket. But he has to end it with this. He festoons the narrative with Moses ascends to heaven, right? And then you see this echoed again with Elijah and Moses meeting Jesus in the Metamorphosis episode, aka the Transfiguration. These are the two figures that had, ascended and now are down, and then vanish again, it's an appearance. And so it's another epiphany, so to speak, of that, in that way, of these patriarchs, the grand patriarchs of the Jewish religion showing up, and that Jesus, it singles him out there and says, this is my beloved son. They wanted to make 3 kind of shrines there on the top of the hill in the Gospel of Mark, and he, in the divine voice comes from heaven and corrects that, kind of the God of the machine, corrects that idea for all of the readers to understand, hey, this one alone is our demigod within this particular system of thought, or and they're not. And so don't make the mistake. Yeah, they ascended, but we want to set them aside a little. We don't want them competing alongside Jesus quite at that level. And so he wants to single, this is my beloved son, listen to him. And so in that, foreshadows his apotheosis at the end of Mark, his missing body. But it's astonishing kind of the contextual decisions that they're almost making it sound like the entirety of the New Testament is written by and for folks that are deeply steeped in Judaism, living in Judah or something like this. And there's a lunacy to that. No, it's written later and external to that, and it's marketed to the larger Greco-Roman world, not to people that are sitting there in synagogues in Judah. And so, sorry, that's just not that's not the literary, that might be the setting in the Gospels is there, as a literary work, but that's not the literary context for these texts. The literary context, many of them are disclosed, like the letter to Corinth. You know exactly who the reasons were there, and more or less were people that had been swimming these kinds of stories for centuries.
So first is Peter. There are 2 epistles in the New Testament attributed to this apostle, 1st and 2nd Peter. Importantly, most scholars do not think that Peter actually wrote both of these texts, especially 2nd Peter, which is one of the most disputed texts in the New Testament. They're still early texts, but probably not both written by Peter. At least one of them is likely a forgery. There are scholars who defend the Petrine authorship of both epistles, of course, but the consensus is against them.
We've talked about the appearances to the 500. We can talk about the appearances to the disciples. But what confidence do we have in particular for an appearance of Jesus to Peter?
The fact of a post-mortem appearance of Jesus to Peter is guaranteed by the list in the very old tradition handed on by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3-5. It is vouchsafed by Paul's personal acquaintance with Peter, and then also in Luke 24:34, we have independent verification or attestation of this appearance. So no scholar today doubts that Peter had such an experience.
Part of the question is, do we just trust certain witnesses who we have a writing in their own words saying they've seen the risen Jesus? So Joe Rogan asks about people who witnessed the resurrection, or it is attributed to them as witnessing the resurrection. That was a piece of the discussion. So in 1 Corinthians 15, this is not Peter's own words, but it's Paul in an early creed referencing Peter. But we could also add there's multiple attestation of this in the different Gospels and, of course, in Acts. But what's interesting, and this would take us aside here, is that if Mark really does report some of the eyewitness account of Peter, as some of the early church fathers indicate, then in Mark 16:7, it says, tell his disciples and Peter, would be an interesting, at least, indication in that direction that Mark and Peter is just firmly aware and proclaiming that Jesus did appear to him. So I think that was some of the debate as it goes to 1 Peter. But nonetheless, for the reasons that we mentioned, although we don't have Peter in his own direct words saying this, given the early multiple accounts that we had, you're arguing that we are on solid ground confirming that there's early evidence for an appearance to Peter, and Peter believed this. Is that fair?
All right. But this is unanimous among New Testament scholarship. I remember the skeptical German New Testament critic Gerhard Ludemann saying that it is historically certain. Now, those are his terms, not mine. It is historically certain that Peter and the earliest disciples had experience of Jesus after his death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. So no New Testament historian denies the historicity of the appearance to Peter.
Okay, I guess I'm going to stand forward and be that exception. I know that I'm a living historian of the, that is a historian of New Testament context and earliest Christian literatures and traditions. And no, it is not, clear that Peter had a bona fide experience of Jesus. There's not, when you look at, did Julius Proculus have a bona fide experience of Romulus? As we go through the different Geminus, did he have a bona fide experience of meeting Caesar Augustus or Claudius on the Appian Way after their deaths? He came forward and gave a sworn eyewitness testimony. We don't even get that in the Gospels, this idea of a sworn testimony in front of Roman officials and this kind of thing. So in a sense, you've got an even higher kind of credibility that's placed on the table there in terms of these early witnesses saying that they had seen Caesar on the road. And we already know that they made that up. If you go into Dio talks about that they were on the payroll. The government, the Roman government was paying them to bring forward these kinds of stories as part of the funerary, part of the agenda of the funerary consecration to bring forward this person that would say that. Now, when you get to Justin Martyr, who's born in the 1st century, writing in the 2nd, he's their top apologist. So that's William Lane Craig is an apologist today, right? Well, his earliest, kind of the grandfather of his, great-great-grandfather of his entire tradition of apologetics, the earliest one we have, Justin Martyr, doesn't make that kind of case at all. He works the other direction. He says that that when we claim that that we've seen Jesus ascend and this kind of thing, and that he ascended, and that and so forth, and bring forth our eyewitnesses and this kind of thing, we're doing nothing new compared to what you do already with your own heroes. And he gives a list there, and then he says, and you bring forward individuals who swear that they've seen Caesar ascend and this kind of thing. And so these are eyewitnesses that are being brought out. And so this idea I think that without them doing a lot of work, I would expect if this were a real, genuine experience that Peter had, what I would expect in 1 Corinthians 15, if that were being conveyed and passed on in some way, I would expect them to work really hard at distinguishing their account. They say this really happened though unlike all of those other stories that you're familiar with that are circulated throughout the entire Roman world, that are in their history books, left and right. Unlike that, this really happened. That kind of work at distinguishing their story from the others isn't present. The only thing that you get is that, well, demons must have inspired these other individuals. Now, this kept going on too. So demons, I guess, continued their inspiration, but demons must have inspired these prior stories to be what they were. And it reminds me of a relative of mine who, we found some bones in the, some fish shells and seashells and stuff in the side of this hill. It's out in the desert. And I said, yeah, how did that get there? And I said, well, this is from probably, a million years ago when there was water there. He said, well, doesn't that draw into question the Bible? And I said, well, it kind of does, actually. If you want to argue that the Bible's claiming to be, the earth 6,000 years old. And he said, well, I think that the devil planted all of those shells in all of them. And I said, do you realize what you're saying? Do you realize the bag of shells that the devil must have been carrying that all around? And that's kind of the argument here that Justin gives, is that the demons inspired all of the larger structure of all of the literatures that we find in classical antiquity to create all of these antecedents that just so happen to preempt the coming of the real. And so the devil must have been pretty busy crafting all of the nuanced literary complexity and borrowing and genetic, and the confluence and the structures of ancient civilizations to somehow produce these texts that have the striking resemblance and, in fact, convey the same literary tropes and conventionality. And even Justin can't deny that they're leveraging the same tropes. They're doing nothing new. And the Greek there is unambiguous. That what they're doing in the crafting of the Jesus legend is nothing new with respect to what those whom you call the sons of Jupiter. And then he gives a whole bunch of stories about divine births and examples, basically a list of examples of people that ascended, that rose from the dead, and so.
If I may probe just to get you to answer this, I can anticipate the question coming from the Christian believer who goes, oh yeah, they were on the payroll and the Roman Imperial swearing of apotheosis tradition or post-death visions, eyewitnesses, the whole nine. But they had no motives. These 12 had no motives. They were completely noble. They had no emperor paying them so many sesterces or, various other excuses. These were righteous people willing to go to their death, and they had no other motivation. You can't pin the tail on the donkey. Can you give us a few possible hypotheses that make really good sense as to what they're doing and why they would make this up? If we don't grant the delusional hallucination or other models to try and make sense of the visions, if we're saying they're fabricated or potentially even invented by the cult leaders themselves, not saying there isn't some superstition mixed in there, but clearly this is part and parcel of cult making. What would you say would be good examples, or what would be the motives?
Well, there's a few things. First, I think the heightened claims that you're getting from William Lane Craig and these individuals that would not have existed for the earliest. They would have seen these other stories. In fact, a lot of the apotheosis stories are in mythography books. They're in other genres that aren't not necessarily in the history books. And so mostly that's kind of the modality of these kinds of stories. This is playful, it's fable. It's not normally taken with that kind of gravity. And so the Caesars just kind of want to be enlisted in that in some way. They want to be, hey, I'm like Heracles. I'm the next Heracles. In fact, they would dress like Heracles or Romulus. And so they want to be, that's kind of part of their fashioning in terms of propaganda. Now, in order to structure a cult and get people around that, well, the emperor cult itself had to compete with the cult of, Dionysus and the cult of Asclepius and the cult of Heracles and the cult of, and you fill in the blank. And so they needed their Caesars to have the same kind of glory in that way. And so their motives the Roman government motives, with Livia and the kind of the institution of the emperor cult under Augustus and after his kind of in his Nachleben after he had died, they had plenty of motive to try and, elevate in order, especially in the East, rulers needed to be divinized. They needed to be, divine in some way in order to kind of maintain their far-flung empire. They definitely need. And we do get evidence that the West, they were a little bit not quite as comfortable with that, with the deification of the emperors as the East was. Now, in terms of cult leaders, well, what motivates any cult leader to cook up their stories? I think we need to start there and then use that as kind of the default and then work out from that. Now, this is a message that's being controlled by the original founding cult leaders at that time. And so, if you take it at face value, that's what's going on there. And so what are their motives? Well, if you look at Lucian, their motives were fraudulent, that they wanted to get people to buy into their story. Now, from my standpoint, exaltatio memoriae was a way of exalting, it was an honorific. So if you read Cicero and these individuals, well, the reason that they elevated certain individuals to divinity was to highlight their significance as benefactors to society. And so this was the Academy Awards, so to speak, the Hall of Fame for certain individuals. And they wanted to elevate their guy. You killed him. Well, if you look at the creed in 1 Corinthians, with a so-called creed, I know it's not creed, it's stuff that was delivered to them in 1 Corinthians 15. What was it? He died on behalf of sins. In other words, you killed him, you Romans, but we're going to flip that around. Or you Jews, you killed him in Jerusalem, high priest and so forth. Well, guess what? Your temple is unnecessary now. He is the ultimate sacrifice. We don't even need you anymore. And so they're flipping the entire thing around. You killed him, Roman government, but guess what? He is exalted to the same height as your highest emperors and your founding figure. So it's kind of like a screw you to both of those institutions. And that's in the earliest, most inceptive mythology of the Christian tradition. And so their motivation, they were battling for their guy in that way, tried to put him on the map and say, hey, you think your heroes are great? Look at ours. So there's that. Now, were they financially benefiting? Well, if we want to take it, I don't know that they were bums and fishermen like it's depicted, but let's just say that they were not aristocratic, they were not wealthy people. Well, guess what? Now they're traveling around the Roman world, which would have been a tremendous luxury at that time to be able to just, go on an endless vacation, so to speak, and travel around and become a celebrity in all these different church plants and tell people how to structure their lives. What a kind of that, you tell me what motivates, you've studied Mormonism, what motivated Joseph Smith, what motivated, Reverend Moon, or what motivated, you fill in the blank with these different original, what motivated Muhammad to cook up his Quran. What motivates any particular, the beginning of every particular religion is usually, if you read against the grain, suspect, to say the least.
If I may bring in one more thing before we move to the next clip, you're going to love this. It's a gem. My friend Matthew Hardkey found it a while back, and we brought it up, and then I just was reminded today, someone brought this up. Now check this out, Dr. Miller. We have this quote right here from Origen's commentary on John. We must also consider the statement, when he comes, he will tell us all things. Did the Samaritan woman say this from tradition or from the law? We know that's from John 4. We must not fail to remark, however, that just as Jesus arose from among the Jews, not only saying that he was Christ, but also demonstrating it, so also, now this is first century, by the way, Origen's commentating on a cult in the first century when he says, so also a certain Dositheos arose from among the Samaritans and declared that he himself was the Christ who had been prophesied. To this day, there are Dosithians derived from him who bring forward books of Dositheos and certain stories about him, describing how he did not taste death, but is alive somewhere. But this is enough on the literal sense. Dude, come on.
Yeah, no, I mean, you could go back. I was actually just reading that same commentary, Origin, by coincidence this morning. Actually, I didn't read that particular segment, but there's parts in there where he even admits that the Gospels, there's some places where, and this is okay, you're dealing with somebody that's really removed from the entire context, and so you got to take it with a grain of salt. But co-leader, or he's a writer in all this in a completely different kind of time and situation, but. He even admits that even in his reading of the Gospels that they are that at times they're weighing spiritual truths with historical kind of facts or historical kind of recollections, and that if push comes to shove, they're going to favor the spiritual truth. In other words, telling a fantastic story over giving something that's a historical kind of depiction, an honest, rigorous depiction of anything. And so even he admits that the content of his sacred text, his Gospels, is that way. But that particular passage is telling. And we see all sorts of movements. If you look at Josephus, how he's got his description of all these different upstarts and movements and troublemakers and stuff that are in Palestine at that time. In his description, that's where you get the Testimonium Flavianum, but it's a redacted kind of inserted, basically hailing Jesus as as the Messiah and this kind of thing. But you've got all sorts of other sign prophets, as one friend of mine calls them, that are there trying to get movements going, trying to get something going. And they get stamped out, and this one got going also and got stamped out, but it did get stamped out. And, it's kind of like the ember. There was enough ember there to get another fire going afterwards, so to speak, and it ended up becoming a religion. But, I think that this is the milieu out of which Christianity was born. Wouldn't it be odd for the deity let's just grant what they're claiming? They're kind of the tall tale that they want us to swallow here, that the deity decided, hey, I'm going to send somebody into that context where there are all these troublemakers and different little sign movements and fraud figures and people trying to cook up stories and create, cultic kind of movements and radical zealotry and this kind of thing. Let's send an actual ontological figure from heaven, my son, myself is what they're even claiming. I'm gonna insert myself into that situation, follow a lot of the same stock patterns, get myself killed, start a movement that's going to create cults that are going to compete right alongside and leverage many of the same conventions and all that, have it be a fledgling movement for 2 centuries, and then get it somehow hitched to the Roman state such that it spreads into medieval Europe. That's really what they're claiming, is that in the genius of the deity, that was the strategy.
The second is Paul. There are 13 epistles in the New Testament attributed to Paul, but many of these are also believed not to have actually been written by him. The consensus is that 7 of them are undisputedly his, whereas the rest are contested. Some, like 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are firmly believed to be pseudonymous, written by somebody else. But even if Paul wrote all of these letters, remember what we're looking for here. Remember what Rogan asked.
Some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection.
Paul never claims to have encountered the physically resurrected Jesus. Even his conversion story in Acts just describes him seeing a flash of light and hearing the voice of Christ while on the road to Damascus. He never even claimed to meet the risen Jesus in the flesh, which I think is what Rogan is looking for here.
Do we have reliable testimony that Paul saw Jesus in the flesh, not just as a vision or a spirit?
Well, now, in the Apostle Paul, we have the testimony of someone who claims to have actually been an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. His experience is recounted 3 times in the book of Acts and is confirmed by Paul's references to it in his own undisputed letters. Now, I'm not really sure what Alex means by seeing Jesus in the flesh. since it's the testimony of the New Testament that a resurrection body is radically different than our present mortal bodies. I think that the question is whether Paul saw simply a blinding light and heard the voice of Christ speaking to him, or whether he saw the bodily form of a person who spoke to him. And it's really hard to know exactly what Paul said. The evidence is not clear. But when Paul says elsewhere in 1 Corinthians, "Have I not seen Jesus, our Lord?" he uses exactly the same language that is used to describe the bodily appearances of Jesus to the other disciples. And so I think it's not at all unlikely. In fact, I'm kind of leaning in the direction of thinking that what Paul saw was the bodily image of a man in that blinding light that was the Lord Jesus.
Now, just for clarification, I think Alex says Paul never claims to have encountered the physically resurrected Jesus. Those are the words that he used. The way I asked it to you is just in terms of seeing him in the flesh. But here's my take, and tell me if you agree with this. Luke recounts Paul's conversion 3 times in Acts, like you said, and indicates there was sound and light, so this is not entirely a subjective internal experience.
Right.
1 Corinthians 15:8, Paul says, "Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." So his appearance would have come after the ascension of Jesus and thus had some differences from the other appearances, but Paul believes it was sufficient to place it on the same level and seemingly kind as the other disciples, which leans me towards some kind of bodily appearance that was there, but maybe with not just as much confidence as some of the others. Is that a fair nuance to you?
Yes, I think that would be a fair assessment, Sean. It's very clear that Paul regarded this experience on the Damascus Road not as a vision of Jesus. He had visions of Jesus at other times later in his ministry, but this was a unique one-time encounter with the risen Lord on the Damascus Road. And therefore, as you say, he's able to include himself in the list of witnesses to the resurrection appearances with a good conscience.
Yeah, geez. We've already talked about a lot of this, and so I don't want to retread too much here, but yeah. So his pneumatic, that's, you get into 1 Corinthians 15, that, he's buried physical, raised in a pneumatic body and this kind of thing. And there's a whole body of discussion around what that means. And I think what people are trying to do when they pry into that is to see, is there some development where originally it was just more like a spirit or something like that, or like a pneuma, or like a non-physical sort of vision or something. And then it later became kind of galvanized in this more like bodily kind of idea. And, there's even, this is entering a larger fray within the larger philosophical world. You notice in Acts where Paul goes and talks about the resurrection of the dead, he goes to Mars Hill and he debates the philosophers supposedly, like they would even want to hear him. But this is the legend, right? That he's there and that they want to indulge listening to him and finding him fascinating and all this stuff. But we do see when we go back and read the actual philosophers that they do talk about what kind of body ascends to heaven and this kind of thing. What's it made of? The animus of Caesar and this kind of thing. Was that physicality? And there is some kind of variance there. You could see the debate going on, and you could even see it in Plutarch when you get into some of his writings as well, and some of the Stoic philosophers and this kind of thing worried about, what's that made of? And so there's a lot of discussion there. And that's where you see most of the earliest Christian talk about the resurrection. If you go and actually do a search on resurrection for like the first 3 centuries of Christianity, that's what you'll find often talked about. Like you'll find whole texts that are titled on the resurrection, and it's them worried about the nature of the body. Like they're fussing about that. They're not discussing the historiological kind of claim at all, really. They're discussing, it's a more of a philosophical discussion about the nature of raised bodies. And you see that in Paul even as well. And so he's entering that same kind of philosophical fray there in 1 Corinthians 15. But the gods had physical bodies. They could fight in wars. They could have sex with people. Actually, this idea of, somebody that's translated. I think there's one or two in my gallery there where they could come back from in their translated state, have an epiphany, and actually fight in a war, or participate in a battle. And so, in write books and so forth, and there's physicality that's present. These are the kind of the abilities of the gods to be able to. First, Jesus can walk through walls, in a closed chamber that's completely locked, show up, somehow, and having walked through the walls, or exiting his tomb while it's still sealed. But then I also can say, touch me and feel me and feed me fish and this kind of stuff. I'm not a mere spirit. And so they're fighting this idea that he's just an aberration in some of these texts. But I would see some variance there between what Paul's doing with the pneumatic body and what's going on with, say, like Luke and this kind of thing regarding, in the touch me, feel me in John and the eating fish in Luke and all this kind of stuff. I think there you could see some difference in terms of some of the ways that they're posturing all of that. And that's all registering within the larger fray. And it's also trying to port in the cargo of Pharisaic Judaism, which had a deep investment in resurrection of the dead and people coming back to life and this kind of thing at the end of the age, and what that would mean in terms of physicality.
And there's a similar problem with the fourth name that Wes mentions, James, whose epistle in the New Testament, again with some dispute over the authorship, also simply does not recount his witness to the resurrection. Wes is wrong to bring him up as well.
Here's the heart of the question, Bill, is we don't have the words of James in his epistle, even though there's debate about whether he wrote that or not, which is somewhat secondary. We don't have words of James himself saying, I've seen the risen Jesus, like we do with Paul. So do we have reason to believe, which Wes Huff cites and believes, that James is a reliable witness of the risen Jesus nonetheless?
The appearance to James is attested in the old tradition handed on by Paul, and it is vouchsafed by Paul himself, who knew James personally. Moreover, I think the appearance is historically plausible as the best explanation for why James, who did not believe in his older brother during his lifetime, suddenly became an ardent follower of Jesus afterward and was even martyred for his faith. So you do not need to have a person's own words describing his experience in order to be historically confident that that person did, in fact, witness such an event.
So I have sympathy for Alex because he's responding to certain books in the New Testament specifically that Wes laid out in terms of Jude and 1 Peter and James. I think that's why he's bringing in the apostleship here. But really, the key point that I think Wes was making, and maybe if you went back and had that conversation again, he might frame it and defend it a little bit differently, is that James is a reliable eyewitness of the risen Jesus, even if we don't have his own words saying that he's seen the risen Jesus. As best I can tell, there's actually three sources that are cited here. Of course, 1 Corinthians 15 that you cited, 7a. But John Dominic Crossan also cites the Gospel of Thomas 12, which is interesting. Even Gary Habermas is not persuaded by that. And then the Gospel of Hebrews, which is dated kind of the first half of the 2nd century. Now, I don't put a lot of credence in those. I think the main source is 1 Corinthians 15. But would you say, I guess I'm curious, how high would you rate our confidence in the appearance of James compared to Paul, where we have his own testimony, or Peter, where we have multiple accounts of it? How much historical confidence would you put in the appearance to James?
Well, I think it's right up there near the top. Now, of course, Paul is indisputable because we have letters from this man in which he talks about the appearance. But with respect to James, as I say, Paul knew James. he met with him during a 2-week period, just within 3 years after his own conversion on the Damascus Road. And James and Peter were telling him that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. And this was then mediated to Paul as well by this very old tradition that goes right back to the first few years of the Christian church in Jerusalem. So we're in contact here with someone, namely Paul, who spoke with James and tells us what he believed. And James then became the leader of the New Testament church, and as I say, was eventually martyred for his faith in Christ. Now, that's remarkable enough in itself, but when you reflect on the fact that James wasn't a follower of Jesus during his lifetime, you've got to have some kind of explanation for this transformation in James that took place. The crucifixion of his older brother wouldn't do it. That would only convince him more deeply that his messianic delusions were insane and brought about his demise. What would produce so transformative a change in James that he would now be willing to die for his belief in Jesus Christ? And I can't think of any better explanation than Paul's words. Then he appeared to James.
Oh, wow. Jeez. Well, first off, it almost sounds like he sees the earliest Christian cult leaders as in concert, like they're all just playing in the same band together. And if you read Galatians 1 and 2, you could see that's definitely not the case. Paul's mocking them. He calls them, you call them the super apostles, whatever you want to call them, the pillars, whatever, what they are, whatever they are, it doesn't matter to me. I didn't get any of my content from them, he claims there. Now, this is contradicted in 1 Corinthians 15. He claims he did receive some things from them. But he says that in Galatians 1 and 2, he says that all of his content he got from an apocalypse within himself. Like, in other words, an internal revelation. Well, he's spitballing. He's off on his own, doing his own thing. And so he's not being trained by, people that saw anything go on in Palestine or anything like that in terms of his ideologies and teachings and cult, that he's very free in that. And I think he's enjoying that freedom to be able to craft the cult however he wants there in Asia Minor and so forth, and Macedonia and those places. And so setting that aside for a second, though, yeah, I'd say it gives a list there. Now they're trying to say that there was this huge Damascus Road experience for even James, which we don't have anywhere. And there's this just radical, this is a family business, of course, James is going to jump on. Hey, this is catching. I'm going to jump in too, it's his brother. And so, I'm assuming that that's the same James that's being mentioned there. So it's not, John the Baptist, was also part of the family according to the early legends or whatever. And so you've got some family members that are jumping in and getting involved in this in some way. And so it's a bit of a family business in that way. And so this idea then that he had this kind of radical, kind of pivotal moment with Jesus or something like that in that way. He uses these words vouchsafe, this kind of stuff. Like, again, I think if you go back into apotheosis legends, this kind of thing, that the swearing, the testimonies that are sworn, even the earliest Christian writers are admitting that their sworn testimonies are in similar kind. There's nothing new with regard to kind of the protocols that are being applied there regarding the swearing of having seen an appearance in this way or another. And so, so this idea that somehow galvanizes his reason to be a Christian in some way, he's free to, anyone's free to be whatever religion they want to, but that's not a rational justification. And especially given the fact that you see that list there now, who are those people? And I brought this up before. Those are the cult leaders. This isn't independent testimony from somebody else that's outside of that. You think there would be a lot of people who'd be like, we don't know what to make of it. We saw this guy that we just killed or whatever, and we're not sure what to make of it. And there would be a lot of testimony coming from that. People that didn't convert necessarily, but that just don't know what to make of it. And or there would be a whole host of others, but no, it happens to be the chief kind of tradents of the tradition there, the people that are controlling and shaping the origins of the cult that are making these claims. And so it doesn't vouchsafe anything. I mean, what other cult in world history would you believe the claims of its cult founders? What they have a stake in trying to feed you a certain kind of myth or system of thought or something like that from the get-go, and that's what they're doing. That's all they're doing. And so, anyway, so the idea that that's somehow reliable or trustworthy or needs to belong in the archives of certified history or something like that, it's crazy.
Dr. Miller, this has been a long ride. There's a lot of content that they brought up. I thought that this video was necessary to have responses from scholars such as yourself and several others, and each episode to be able to spend the time to explain your own personal scholarly opinion. If you were to put a bow on a box here for the whole picture of what you see, what would be that bow?
Well, okay, so you've got the problem with Christianity, and this is different than the other religions. Like if you decide you don't believe in, say, Heracles or the divinity of Caesar Augustus, well, there's some danger there because you need to be careful with the Roman government. But say it were the case that privately you decided that you weren't going to believe that as true or something like that in your private sentiments or something, there would be no real consequence. You're not going to hell. There isn't Hades hanging over people. Like if you don't believe in the divinity of Apollonius, or if you don't believe in the stories surrounding Dionysus, Bacchus, this kind of thing, there was no particular consequence to that. You could go down the street and find another cult if you wanted to, or just decide that wasn't your thing to follow these cults quite that closely. It wasn't this kind of existential gun to your head. And really, I come out of that system. I actually attended Dr. Craig's academy there. He's on the payroll, I guess, at Talbot School of Theology. I have a master's degree from there. So I know what that kind of system of thought feels like and what it's like. I was trained there, and you have to argue with its history, because to do otherwise would be to express unbelief. And to express unbelief would be implicitly to fall out of faith, and therefore out of salvific grace, and therefore to go to hell, to be tormented forever and to be damned forever. That's what's on the table here. That people see this as kind of this equal debate, like there's this side and there's that side. I don't see that at all on the landscape, and that's why I pretty much do not talk to or find myself in conversation with apologists a whole lot, because I feel like that they have a particular position that they are going to fight for, no matter the evidence. They're going to wage that war because they have to stay there, because their own salvation is at stake in this, and they want to make sure that, and so they're presenting one position in this, and they're going to stay there in that position no matter what goes on in the conversation. And so I was invited recently to do a talk with a particular apologist. You know who it is. And I'm probably going to decline, because I feel like I can't have an honest conversation. That's not going to be the outcome of the discussion. It's going to be coming from a place of trying to make me look silly, or trying to make, I'm not going to have someone on the other end of the conversation that's prepared to learn. And like I would be open to learning. I like to sit down, you've got a whole bunch of guests on your show. Some of them I agree with more than others, but I feel like I could learn from every one of them. And so I would, if I ever got into a conversation with any of them, my intention would be to learn. And they're incapable of that. Individuals that are kind of staking out this position, they're going to defend this citadel no matter what. And so that to me is problematic in the conversation. That to me, that's not a dialogue or a discourse or an honest conversation at that point. It's incapable of that. It's kind of disqualified from ever being that. And so that's a problem. And I don't mean that as disrespect. William Lane Craig, clearly a decent gentleman in terms of the way he carries himself. I've even had some interactions with him and some of the people that are involved in his show and stuff. And they do seem like decent people. And like I said, I ended that school, the Talbot School of Theology. I enjoyed having relationships with all the different professors there, and still have a considerable amount of respect for certain individuals that teach there. But you have to understand the context, where they're coming from and why and what they're up to. And that to me is very, very different than a humanistic discourse investigating ancient history, attempting to understand what motivated and what structured early Christian belief and communities and texts and this kind of thing. That has to happen, I think, within a open conversation where people are free to take any position that the evidence indicates, and to pursue that with tenacity without a particular outcome that's needed at the other end of it, other than just honesty.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Richard C. Miller. I hope you've had a blast learning from him. I always do. There's so much insight. You have a unique perspective. It is radically different than even some people who are close to you in terms of ideas. And it makes you very unique. And I'm looking forward to seeing how the final product of the various critical scholars lined up will look. It will be a buffet of ideas. And that's important, I think, as well, to show we don't need to be dogmatists with one flavor of ice cream. We are in Baskin-Robbins here. The apologist needs you to eat vanilla. That's it. It has to be vanilla. Ladies and gentlemen, we got sherbet. We got everything under the sun here. Come get some. So, Dr. Miller, thank you so much for your time, your insights. Any final words?
No, I just enjoy that this discussion is happening, and that the critical investigation, a lot of times people are fed a particular kind of perspective from a religious-based kind of idea, and I appreciate you hosting a show that brings in experts from various walks and people that have dedicated their lives to trying to understand these things as thoroughly and as accurately as possible. And so I appreciate you very much, Derek. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like this, hit the like button, share it out, and never forget, we are MythVision.